Fred, tell our viewers and our listeners, what was it like growing up in Long Island, New York, and just like Michelle was telling, she's from New York, Queens, and etc.
Sure. Long Island was a great place to grow up. I mean, the proximity to New York City gave you access to all the greatest things that were available at the time. It was the late 60s and early 70s when I grew up as a kid. We had our, local beaches that we could access. The educational system there was actually pretty good for public education. The lifestyle was, the typical average suburban community of those days. It was a really nice place to grow up. Now I've actually lived on Hilton Head Island for about 30 years. I've actually now lived here longer than any other place in my life. But I'm very happy to have been able to have grown up on Long Island at the time I did.
Wow. In college, I see that you studied several different things. You studied psychology, political science, and economics, and at the University of Albany of New York. You
Yes,
know
sir.
what?
I had the
What
misguided idea that I was going to become a lawyer.
what attracted you to focus on particular things that you are doing right now?
Well, it's really interesting. I lived through a period where things were beginning to change in my lifetime that had been the same for a very, very long period of time. So back in 1971, when I was a young pup, we went through a fundamental change in the United States that was the most single dramatic change to monetary policy since the 1790s. And that was the removal of the standard of gold and silver against US paper money. So previously, up to this point, 1971, the federal government could not create paper money unless it had sufficient supplies of gold and silver to back each and every paper note it printed. The concept was actually fairly simple. The idea was to protect the public from having money just continually printed without some sort of financial backing to prevent an inflationary problem. And when Richard Nixon removed this gold standard in 1971, honestly, I was too young to really understand what was wrong with this, except something intrinsically hit me that said, this is not right. This is a problem. And there's a good reason why we've had the systems we've had for as long as we've had. And my fundamental gut belief was that the people who had originated the monetary system we'd had up to 1971 were a lot smarter than the people who were in politics in the 1970s. So I sort of just couldn't accept the idea that these guys were somehow now more intelligent to make these fundamental changes and decisions that would affect everybody's wealth, and lived through that. And it just stuck with me as I grew older. So I began to research the idea of what money was all about.
Wow. As you know, my producer Todd was talking about gold, which is the standard, still the world standard, and and currency. I'm talking about a different type of currency, but everything. And you mentioned that under Rich Nixon, he kind of changed a couple of things. Can you tell our audience? We got like 2 minutes before the break, first break. Why did you, or what inspired you to look deeply into the coin or Bitcoin, however that is, industry?
Well, again, one of those things was that fundamental 71 change, which just stuck with me. The other was that in 1963, on November 22nd, when JFK was assassinated, um, my birthday is November 22nd. So that event followed me for the rest of my life. Every year on my birthday, they revisited the Kennedys and the Kennedy assassination and the whole story surrounding it. In 1964, the last silver coins in the United States were minted with President Kennedy on the half dollars. And as the silver came out of the change in 64, and these Kennedy half dollars remained as the last actual silver coins, again, it just struck me that there was some fundamental tie here between what was happening and what I was experiencing in my life. I began again to question the concept, why was silver being removed from US change? And it turned out it took me a while to come to understand the problem was that a 25-cent silver quarter at some point after 1964 had more than 25 cents worth of silver in it. In other words, the metal value began to exceed the face value, which created a fundamental problem. So silver came out of the change. And after 1964, we started to see quarters and dimes that had no silver in them.
Wow. Hey, Fred, what are your thoughts on that one? Because now you guys gonna have me looking for quarters that or anything that made before 1964.
including 64, right? And it's a smart move. So a silver quarter from 1964 is worth about $5 or $6 today. What's interesting is that back the last year that they produced silver quarters, 5 silver quarters or $1.25 face value was the standard wage. And that was a sufficient wage for an average American to keep a job, pay his taxes, buy a home, and have a little bit of savings. Today you look at what the value of $1.25 is, and it's insane. Of course, those silver quarters today at about $6 or so a coin, you're looking at around a $30 hourly wage in today's real world in the value of the silver content and the value of the silver coin. It illustrates the gap between what's happening for Americans and the difference between paper money and the original gold and silver coins that the U.S. Treasury used to produce, that unfortunately most Americans now are experiencing an inflationary problem because we have a fundamental flaw in the way monetary systems are operating in America.
Wow. I have not even thought about that because when it comes to the coins, and I see why we have a lot of coin collectors out there that's pulling these things back. This is a very interesting topic, very interesting a thing to know because just like I said, I'm going to be looking for anything that's 64 and below.
I would. I used to have local customers who would run down to the bank and take a couple $100 in cash and ask them for 50-cent piece rolls and get the $50 and then just simply go through them and see if they could pick out any that were partial or were silver. And as your previous guest just mentioned, it was a little bit easier years ago. You'll see fewer and fewer of them now, as most people do recognize that difference in the way they look and the way they sound. And of course, the value is so substantially different now that it is worthwhile for people to kind of scour through. Large investors are also accumulating large quantities of these original gold and silver pieces as wealth protection. Because unfortunately, what Americans are experiencing, and this relates to the issue that you raised at the beginning of the show, why is the cost of everything going up so much? The problem fundamentally is it's the value of the money that's deteriorating. The items are basically the same. It's the same box of Cheerios and the same ground beef pound. They have not fundamentally changed. It's the same barrel of oil and the same gasoline that we're all using. What's changed is the value of the money that we're using to purchase these items is being eroded out from under our feet, by the way, by an entity that the U.S. public has no control over. The Federal Reserve, which operates behind the scenes, is a privately owned corporation, not part of the United States government. So we have unelected officials who are affecting the lives of every American.
Wow. So why haven't there been a push on letting Americans know about this prior? I'm talking about that the silver has changed and that prior 64 and prior to that if you had some of those things, you might want to consider the value, or you might want to. I'm talking about there. I have not heard a push on that to educate the public.
Well, the problem is that we get distracted as a public by all the modern issues that are going on, so much so that bigger pictures like this get lost in the background. How many people fundamentally understood that the Federal Reserve, when it was enacted in 1913, was actually a coalition of bankers who had wanted to take over the issue of money in America, and that battle had been going on since the 1790s when the Founding Fathers first established the first monetary system. Interestingly, the Founding Fathers actually had this kind of conversation in 1785 at the end of the Revolutionary War, as we came close to deciding how to create the new America. Not only did we have to create a government, but we also had to create a banking system and a monetary policy. And the Founding Fathers were fearful that either politicians or bankers in the future might end up gaining control over money. So they instituted a system of money made from gold and silver specifically to avoid all the kinds of fundamental debt problems that we experience now. I don't think they ever would have believed that we'd be sitting now in 2023 with the United States government that's $33 trillion in debt and paying over $1 trillion a year now just in interest payments. This was unprecedented thinking. And it comes about because, again, fundamental decisions were made behind the scenes, but a lot of efforts have been made to keep the public at bay from grasping the nature of the changes in monetary policies.
Wow. Hey, Todd, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. because you was explaining some things about 1964 and all that. What are your thoughts on what Fred just said?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I never really thought of it as like to invest in coins for security with to kind of combat inflation and whatnot. But it's a great idea. It kind of the large investors get, buying them. Maybe that's why I can't find them so much anymore. So, but I think it's a great idea for diversity investments to go out there and get some of these coins.
I think it is too. So, hey, Fred, I want to change the topic a little bit. I want to talk about why you chose the topic of the show, uh, cash crash at the checkout and the great grocery grumbles. Can you explain to our viewers and our listeners why this is so important, why you chose this, and why that awareness of the public need to be made?
Absolutely, because we are really experiencing a fundamental change in the United States at a level and a rate that has never been seen before. What I mean by that is that when inflation, which is, we can describe what inflation is in economic terms, and we can define it based upon how economics is used to define the word. Reality is that inflation is experienced by people when they get less for their money. So what's happening is inflation is way ahead of the wage increases and price increases that people are getting. We're not keeping pace as Americans. The cost of goods and services are increasing faster than Americans' wages and income. So this creates a gap. And unfortunately, the government has been utilizing a gimmick, which is to print unbacked money whenever it runs out of capital. Back when we had a gold standard up to 1971, or even the silver coins up to the 1960s, you couldn't simply float paper money without having something technically backing it that was tangible. Nowadays, we have that requirement removed completely. So the government is free to print any amount of paper money it wants. So let's say it spends more than it brings in. It can make up that gap by simply creating that additional money. It solves the government's short-term problem, but it creates a huge problem for Americans, which is the inflation of the value of their money. So the reason I bring this up now is because since 2020, the rate of inflation and the rate of monetary expansion has been the single most rapid increase in the history of the United States. We have leaped from what was billions in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We're now dealing in trillions. And although the numbers don't sound so dissimilar, mathematically, they are vastly apart. It's 1,000-fold difference between a billion and a trillion. And when the government is deficit spending now trillions each year and it continues to create that additional money to make up that gap, what they're doing to the American public is diluting the value of their wealth. It would be like if I took a cup of black coffee and poured it in the bottom of a tub and slowly added water to the tub and periodically would scoop out a cup of the mixture. The more water that I add, the lighter that cup of coffee starts to look until eventually, if the tub is filled with water, it's been diluted so much that it'll probably be completely clear. And this is the kind of problem that people are experiencing. People are now seeing inflation for the first time so vividly, it's becoming impossible to ignore it. And I think it's critical that Americans recognize this is going to get far worse in the next 5 years than it has the past 2 years, which have been incredible. And I think people should prepare themselves for that by counterbalancing their wealth with something that actually would appreciate over the next few years while the value of the paper money they're holding continues to be inflated.
Okay, I am getting such an education from my great guests here. And, a lot of ideas and things that many of us don't even think about because, first of all, if we lack understanding and we don't want to understand, we don't know. But when it's fed to you and the light come on, you have that aha moment. Then you start to think, at least I hope that you start to think, that what can I do to extend the value of the money or the control of the dollar that I have? And I believe that Fred is giving such great advice and educating us on a lot of things, and especially when it comes to the supermarkets, grocery stores, and things that are happening there. So Fred, I want to pick it back up there. I understand that prices has climbed to an all-time high, like you just said, and a lot of things that are going on. Who who's are responsible for that?
That's a great question. So, originally we had a system that was not supposed to require exactly what you brought up. Most people are not aware of this, and nor should they have to be. We've got our own issues, we've got our families to deal with, we have our careers and our lives to pay attention to. We shouldn't, as Americans, have to be following an organization like the Federal Reserve, a central bank of a country, in order to figure out whether or not the value of money we're earning today, week to week, is going to actually have any buying power in 5 or 10 years from now. This is not what we were supposed to have as a monetary system. In fact, we prevented exactly this problem by maintaining the gold and silver standard against the US dollar. So this is why that was so significant in 71 when that standard was removed against paper money, and after 1964 when silver was pulled from US change. So, the public has got a problem. We are, as you said, all in this together. And we're facing an enemy that we should not have to deal with. We should not be forced to have to concern ourselves with the future value of money. So there's two responsible parties when it comes to this. One is the central bank itself. The Federal Reserve System as a whole is seriously flawed because it affords the opportunity for a government to deficit spend money knowing that it has a backstop. And I've made the analogy before. It's as if you had a friend with a gambling problem, but you had so much money that every time he blew through everything he had and couldn't borrow another cent, he'd come to you and you'd make a loan to him and bail him out. Well, what's to prevent him then from going back to the casino and running another run? He knows that you're his backstop. He knows that you're there for him and that you're not going to stop giving him the capital he needs to survive. So he keeps on gambling and he keeps on losing money. Well, what if you weren't there anymore? Reality would kick in very quickly and he'd have to face the piper. Unfortunately, with America, the government has got the backstop, and that's the Federal Reserve System standing there saying to them, we don't care if you spend $1 billion, $1 trillion, or $5 trillion you don't have. We'll print all the money that you need. We will do that for you because it just simply adds to the amount of debt that the U.S. government carries, and it benefits the Federal Reserve central banks, but does not benefit the public who has to experience the loss in the value of that currency that these guys in the background are playing with. So we're not supposed to have to pay attention to this stuff. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the problem is accelerating. It's not a 2% inflation like we had in the 60s, where 98% of the value of your money was still there a year later. It's hardly noticeable. But 8% inflation, well, that means over 3 years, you've lost a quarter of your money. Over 5 years, you've lost almost 50% of the value of your money. And if your wages are not going up that rapidly, you're drowning and you're losing more and more value no matter how much you're earning. And unfortunately, wages and income are not keeping up with the rate of inflation. So Congress is to blame for spending money of the U.S. public it doesn't have. But it can't seem to control itself because we've gotten so far into debt with $33 trillion worth of bonded national debt. Each political person who comes into power is faced with the same problem. So I'm going to make you president tomorrow. And I'm going to say you currently now have all the authority to make any decisions you want. So how are you going to solve the problem with $33 trillion in debt? There's only two ways to do it. And it's the same as an individual who spends more money than he doesn't have. You either have to reduce your spending or you have to increase your income. And when the government wants to increase its income, that means it's going to look to you and I because it's going to raise our taxes to do that. And if we're going to ask the government to stop spending money it doesn't have, it's going to have to make some cuts into services that people get. And no one wants to be the politician that says, well, we can't afford to pay Social Security anymore. Or we can't afford any of the social programs that are available because we don't have the money. So I'm going to say as a politician that, okay, I can fix the trillions in debt, but it's going to cost you. You're going to have to pay higher taxes. And I don't mean just a little bit. I mean, your taxes would have to go up fivefold or tenfold to even make a dent in the problem. And subsequently, simultaneously, the government would have to reduce its spending by trillions of dollars. What's actually happening is exactly the opposite. We're not collecting more taxes, and the government is spending more and more money every year that it takes in. So the problem is getting vastly worse, and unfortunately, it's the public that bears the brunt of it.
Fred, you speak the truth. I mean, you're absolutely right. And we know the Federal Reserve, right, has raised, I think, 10 times in 2023, the federal rate. And you're right, you have to reduce spending or increase taxes. From a political perspective, and it's not about the people. The political, they're divided on each side, and I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm just going to say it right now. They have to come together. They have to understand that cuts, spending, American people, we have to look at the American people first. I don't know if what the Federal Reserve is doing with the hikes, and my understanding, they probably gonna hike a couple more times. It just happened or hurting
Well,
the
here's the
American people.
problem. So the Federal Reserve began to print massive amounts of money after the pandemic in 2020. Why did they do that? Well, the idea was the economy had come to a screeching halt. I mean, a lot of people remember major cities were closing down and stores, offices, a lot of businesses folded. People could not earn a living. The whole economic environment had really come to a screeching halt, like somebody had slammed on the brakes. So the Fed turned to itself and said, we need to stimulate economic activity. What's the easiest way to do that? You make money available and make it cheap. Because if you and I can borrow money at 0% or 1% or 2%, well, we're a lot more likely to borrow a lot of money and go buy that new home or buy the new refrigerator or buy that new car or spend that capital because the money is available and inexpensive. But what happens when the Fed continues to do that and increases the supply of money so much and so rapidly that not only do they get the economy kickstarted, but they subsequently create another problem they didn't intend to, which is they begin to inflate money very quickly. Because this flooding of cheap money into the economy, yes, it may stimulate activity, but it also devalues currency. So now the Fed is faced with another problem. It's overdone the amount of printing, so much so that inflation is starting to rip through the economy at a pace we haven't seen in 20, 30 years. And what is the response from the Fed when it creates inflation? Well, now we need to slow the economy down. That's how you fight inflation. How do you do that? You raise the interest rates again and again and again. And you're right, it's 10, 11 times that the Fed has raised rates simply in an effort to slow economic activity because of all the money they printed since 2020. And here we are now in 2023, and we're at a tipping point where the Fed is trying to say, okay, maybe we've gone too far. And if we do this too much and choke the economy too hard, well, then we could end up in a recession. And we're kind of back where we started with low economic activity. And then the Fed would have to lower rates again to move the economy forward. This is just like an up and down roller coaster ride that we're going through. So the Fed is facing a huge problem of trying to walk this tightrope. Can they raise rates enough to slow the inflation problem down so that your listeners and I don't experience this massive increase in costs at the supermarket? But can we not go too far to tip the scales and by virtue of trying to slow down the cost increases, also choke the economy down so that business slows down so much that we don't have any economic activity and the Fed is then again forced to lower rates and start all over again?
And Fred, what are your thoughts on this? And predictions is what I'm trying to say is based on today's times, on everything that's happening today, where do you see tomorrow?
You know, it's a great question. The problem has been that a lot of people are so worried that many have made a kind of an extrapolation leap to suggest that the US dollar might implode, that the debt might become so overwhelmingly large that it becomes a vicious cycle. They could barely pay the interest, so they borrow more money to pay interest payments on existing debt. If interest rates go up, of course, carrying $33 trillion worth of debt becomes a lot more expensive. So it's a fundamental cycle that continues to grow. So, some people have actually been buying a lot of gold and silver coins with an expectation of the US dollar, simply imploding. Now, I actually don't believe it'll get that bad because I do think we will print our way out of the problem. So what I'm looking at in the future is a lot of inflation, and a lot more rapid than we've experienced in recent years. In fact, there's probably a whole generation of Americans who never really experienced inflation, except for what we saw last year at about 8.5%, because they've had the experience since 2009 of rates being near zero. So they've grown up in a world where, interest rates were always cheap and it was never a big problem and inflation was a non-issue. But we're past that point now. I've been at this gold and silver coin business for close to 40 years. And in my first couple of decades, we honestly thought we could rally the public to educate people and get everybody aware of this problem and perhaps push our congressmen and find somebody who would stand up and do something. A few made some efforts. The most infamous was probably Dr. Ron Paul. And if people are not familiar with him, look this guy up and look at some of the conversations he had with Congress going back even to the 1990s, how he expanded upon where we would be today if things didn't change. And they didn't. And he predicted exactly what we would experience now. So in the future, what I think is going to happen is we'll have kids and grandkids who grow up and pay $50 at Starbucks for a cup of coffee. And it'll seem perfectly normal to them. And they'll laugh about us as old people telling them stories about when we used to buy, coffee for $1. It'll be like, my grandfather used to tell me stories. He used to go to the supermarket, buy candy bar for a nickel. Okay. Well, those days are gone. In fact, I had a client of mine, her mother recently passed. Her father and mother had been married for almost 50 years. And the father had not been to the supermarket. The mother did the shopping for the home. So he went with the daughter once, just, to keep her company, and walked up to the counter and picked up a candy bar and put it up on the counter. And the girl says, that'll be $3.50. And he looks at her and says, well, wait, I just want one. And she said, yeah, yes, sir. It's $3.50. And he's standing there with a quarter in his hand, bewildered by what's happened since the last time he went to a supermarket. So I think Americans ought to be prepared for that type of change. Everything you buy and everything you spend money on is going to cost you more. And I used to believe that we could get Congress to do something. They could, as we talked about earlier, potentially reduce their spending, or even, God forbid, raise taxes, which nobody wants. But if it would solve the problem, it might almost be worthwhile. But neither of those are going to work anymore because the size of the problem right now has gone so far beyond the ability of the government to intervene. It can't raise taxes enough, and it can't lower spending enough to actually do anything to change the size of the problem. The only issue now is how fast we're going to print our way out of this. So I would say for Americans, the best thing you could do is protect yourself against this inevitable loss in paper money by counterbalancing your own personal wealth with some physical gold and silver coins or anything tangible. I have people that buy rare guitars, rare motorcycles, vintage cars. These physical items, tangible things you can put your hands on, touch and feel, that should be a portion of everyone's wealth. And for those people that have larger amounts of money, they're experiencing right now a vast problem, which is the interest payments that banks are offering on CDs and bank accounts and money markets and mutual funds are not high enough to cover the rate of inflation. So even though they're gaining money at the end of the year, they're actually getting less buying power with that additional money. So I think the future is problematic. Again, I don't experience or believe that we're going to experience this ultimate demise and collapse of the dollar where, it's like anarchy on the streets. You can't spend paper money to buy goods and services. I don't think that would make much sense for anybody, especially the powers that be, because the entire world's economies would all come to a crash and screeching halt overnight if the U.S. paper dollar was completely worthless. But I do believe instead of one word worthless, we should be looking at the two words worth less. And that to me seems inevitable.
Hey Fred, we got like 3 minutes left in the show, but we as Americans, we as we, right now we're in a divided political world, meaning that neither party cares about anything other than power. Other than power, was you Republican, was you Democrat?
And you know how big of a problem that is. So right now, for example, we have a debt ceiling problem. So the government has spent all the money that Congress has said you're legally allowed to spend. We've hit that limit. So now they can't spend any more money unless they shut the government down or raise the debt limit. In other words, agree that they're going to go further into debt. And just like you said, these two parties, they can't get along. They can't even agree on the simplest thing, which is to raise the debt limit. It's not as if this is new money that we're talking about. This is money already spent, and we're just trying to agree to allow Congress to say, okay, we authorize the creation of more debt because we have to pay our bills. Because the other option is we either shut government down or the US government starts to default on its debt obligations. So if you're holding a treasury bond and the government has promised you'll get your principal and interest, if they were to turn around and say, I'm sorry, Dr. Cooley, we just don't have the money to pay you, the onslaught of problems that would create would devastate the world's economy. So these guys can't even get along to agree to the simplest thing, like raising the debt limit. I don't see them really getting together and, magically somehow coming up with a solution to this problem anytime soon. I've kind of lost faith in both parties.
Lost faith. Hey Fred, we're down to like 1 minute of the show. I gotta tell you that this is so important. Krista, I see that you're watching. We gotta have this guy back on again real soon. We got so much more we had to talk about. So, Fred,
and I promise I'll have the technology problems worked out by then.
Hey Fred, real quickly, if our listeners want to get in touch with you and reach out to you for your services or enlist you into helping them out, how can they do that?
Well, the easiest way is our 800 number, 800-878-COIN. That's 800-878-2646. Visit our website. It's US Coin Capital. And capital spelled like the building. So CAPITOL, US Coin Capital. We have our Facebook page. We have our YouTube channel, all under US Coin Capital. Feel free to reach out. And again, our 800 number, 800-878-2646. We have a really well-educated staff that will walk people through how to do this properly, how to correctly accumulate gold and silver coins as wealth protection. We've worked from people who've never done this before, who honestly wouldn't know the difference between a dime and a dollar, to some very sophisticated investors who've spent, millions with us. So we're happy to help.
Hey, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the James Cooley Show. It's your life. And again, hey, Crystal, please get in touch with Michelle. Got to have this guy back. I'd like to thank Dr. Michelle Cooley for putting together another great show. I'd like to thank my producer, Tyree, of KCBQ FM, 96.1 AM, 1170 Answer, San Diego, for always, hooking up things, making me look good. Most importantly, I'd like to thank our viewers and our listeners for tuning in to the James Cooley Show. It's your life, Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Always dream big, think big, and be big. We'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. It's your life.